Melissa here with you today, and today we're going to be talking about some serger skills beyond the basics. In my last video, I talked about some very basic skills like how to thread your serger, how to start and stop sewing on it, and things like that. Today we're going to be covering how to handle the extra threads at the beginning and ends of your seams, how to handle corners, how to handle curves, and how to unpick a serger seam. Let's talk first about what you do with the extra thread ends that end up on your fabric. You have a few options to handle these, and option number one is to do nothing. That is actually what I do on any seam that I sew that's going to be crossed by another seam. If it's going to be sewn over by another seam, I just let the knife on the serger cut off my extra thread tail end and it gets secured in that next seam. However, if you are serging decoratively, or if you're not going to be crossing this with another seam, maybe it's on a hem, you need to know what to do with your ends. So there are a few more options for that. One is to take your tail ends there and thread them through a large-eyed needle. And then you can flip this over to the wrong side and use your needle to weave those ends under the looper stitching on the back side. So hopefully you can see, poking my needle under there. And I'm going to weave those thread tails under, and then I can trim off the extra, and those are secured underneath. Another option is to cut off your thread tails closer to your fabric and then pull your looper thread until it's really tight. So I'm pulling both my upper and lower looper pieces, and I am going to knot those two together. And then you can trim, after you've double knotted, you can trim those thread ends off. And that will hold pretty securely, but as you can see, it pinches the end off here. So that's not always ideal. So I'm going to show you two more methods to weave in your ends while you're sewing. So for this one, I'm going to show you at the beginning of a seam how to weave in an end. I'm going to start stitching and I'm going to stop like 1 or 2 stitches onto the fabric. Okay, there my needle is touching the fabric, so I'm going to go ahead and pull my flywheel towards me until my needles are all the way up. I'm going to pick up the presser foot. I'm going to take my thread end and I'm going to pull it all the way over here to the edge. And I want to kind of stretch, see if you can see that, stretch the chain out into that edge. And then lower the presser foot and continue to stitch. So what that does is it takes these ends and it weaves it under as you're stitching and then kind of cuts off the excess. And you can see that right there. There's also a method to do this as you are finishing a seam. So let me flip this around and we're going to stitch to the edge. So I want to stop just 1 or 2 stitches past the edge here. And then I'm going to lift the presser foot. I'm going to pull my fabric gently towards the back to release the tension. And I'm going to flip my fabric over, and then I want it right next to the knife, but not beyond the knife. I don't want to trim off what I just sewed. Lower the presser foot. And then about halfway up, angle your fabric away from the presser foot so that you can chain off. So as you can see, I flipped it over here. So I've got my ends secured because they've been stitched on both sides. And now I can just cut that thread off and pull the looper threads to tighten it. And I don't even have to tie them this way. I can just pull them tight and then cut them off. And that portion is what it would look like. So it's overlapped. You can see where I angled off the overlap. And we're actually going to start with corners. So I have a sample piece of fabric here, and I've got both outside and inside corners on it, and we're going to go ahead and sew that. Let me show you how to handle an outside corner first. So we're going to stop right at the edge of the fabric, hand crank your machine 1 or 2 stitches, and stop with the needle up. Then release your presser foot, pull your fabric towards the back a little bit, and that will allow you to turn it, put the presser foot back, and you want it positioned as far back and close to those needles right here as you can, and then start stitching again. So there is my outer serged corner. Let's do the inner corner next. I'm going to start stitching, and then as we get to that point, we're just going to try to pull and straighten out that corner so it's a straight line. And it doesn't make it a very sharp corner, but unless you need a really sharp corner, which is generally not the case when you're using a serger, that is the easiest way to do an inner curve. If you need that sharp corner, you'll have to do it kind of like how we did the outer corner, where you stop, you pull, you reposition your fabric. Let's take a look at handling curves. So I have a circular piece of fabric here, and I'm going to put that in. And then I'm just kind of putting tension so that the fabric turns as I stitch. When you get back around to where you started, you'll kind of overlap, and there will be sort of a sharp point that you want to make sure to cut off as you're overlapping. So here is my round piece with serged edges, and you can see right there where the stitching overlapped. Finally, let's talk about sewing something round, like if you have a cuff or a pants leg and you need to serge around the bottom for some reason. So I always feed it in like I'm going kind of at an angle here. Until it gets under the presser foot and I'm keeping the edge even with my seam guide. And just like I did when I was stitching the circle, you'll see I've got kind of a point there where I fed it on at an angle. I'm going to overlap until they're even again. So if I turn this right side out, you can see it easier. There's the spot where I overlapped until they were even, so I don't have that sharp point from stitching around the cuff. So here we have a 4-thread overlock stitch on the side of the fabric. And you'll notice on one side, this is the back side, there are just loops. You can't see the stitching that comes from the 2 needles stitching through it. On the front side, you can see that stitching. You can see the row of stitches here and the row of stitches here. So to unpick a serged seam, you can certainly do like you would do with a regular sewing machine stitch seam and, you know, try to unpick in between the 2 pieces of fabric, but there is an easier way. You want to start with this top row of stitching here, and you want to pull out one of those stitches, and then your fabric will determine how far you can go, but you want to pull out that one line of straight stitching that's closest to the edge. Okay, you see that? Now I've only got 3 threads. Then I'm going to come in between these loops and I'm going to pull out the second line of stitching. Just find a stitch that you can pull up, pull out, and pull that one out. And once you have those out, the 2 looper threads just come right off. So those are some serger skills that go beyond the basics, and I think it's a great idea to practice these skills, especially before you start sewing clothing with your serger if you're brand new to it. So this playlist that I have linked has a couple of projects that are great for practicing your serger skills before you graduate to sewing clothing. They use upcycled fabric or scrap fabric, and because they're not clothing themselves, they're really great to help practice your serger skills before you go and work on something that you love.